Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, imagine yourself standing where this story took place and leave, at least in your own mind, the answer to two simple questions. Where are you listening from, and at what exact time, day or night, does this history reach you? Because stories like this are not just about the past. They echo into whatever hour you're hearing them now. The year was 1841 when the first truly strange occurrences at Foresight Estate were finally noted, though the darkness that fed them had taken root years earlier. Just 3 miles east of Savannah's historic district, the Plantation house rose with all the arrogance of Southern prosperity. White columns like sentinels against the Georgia sky. Gardens kept with obsessive care, walkways swept clean, and facades polished until they reflected sunlight like a lie. To a passer-by, it was a picture of order and success, but just beneath that carefully staged surface, something crueler and more complicated was unfolding, almost entirely hidden from the official record. The story truly begins in the winter of 1835, when a young enslaved woman named Elellanena Bowmont arrived at Foresight Estate. Her presence entered history the way so many lives did in that era, as a line of cursive handwriting in a county ledger, a transaction recorded with a price but without a voice. Parish records would later state that she was 22 years old, described as having exceptional domestic skills, though those who spoke about her in whispers long after believed that was not the real reason she was purchased. Thomas Harrington, the 46-year-old master of Foresight, had recently lost his wife to consumption. Witnesses reported seeing him at the market for weeks, inspecting newly arrived enslaved people with particular interest in the young women, before finally choosing Elellanena. A caretaker's journal found during renovations in 1958 captured a chillingly quiet moment around her arrival. New arrival today, master seems unusually attentive to her quarters, requested the room adjacent to the kitchen be prepared with particular care, unusual for January. It was a small sentence, but in hindsight it read like the opening line of a tragedy. At first, Elellanenna's presence blended into the rhythms of plantation life. She labored alongside roughly 30 other enslaved people who worked the cotton fields, maintained the manor house, and kept the machine of Foresight running. Yet, according to household records, her situation began to diverge from the others with unnerving speed. She was moved inside the main house, assigned directly to attend Thomas Harrington. Within a year, estate expense ledgers show subtle but unmistakable changes surrounding her. Purchases of finer fabrics than were ever allotted to the others, a pair of leather shoes, and, most strikingly, a small silver locket. The receipt for that locket was later found tucked into Harrington's personal Bible, uncovered in a trunk in the attic in 1962. From beyond the property line, rumors traveled just as reliably as wagons and letters. In a 1948 oral history recorded by her grandson, Maria Wilson, who had worked as a cook at a neighboring plantation, recalled, "Everyone who worked the big houses knew what was happening at Foresight. The master had taken a fancy to the Bowmont woman. She wasn't treated like the others. She took her meals in the house, wore finer clothes, but there was something in her eyes that wasn't right, like she was there, but not there." By the spring of 1837, the consequences of this favor could no longer be ignored. Elellanena was visibly pregnant. No announcement was made, there were no celebratory gatherings, no official acknowledgement, only quiet adjustments in the records. Estate documents show that she was relieved of some of her heavier duties. The plantation physician, Dr. Samuel Thorne, began visiting more frequently, his medical log for that period filled with vague references to a delicate condition at Foresight. In November of that year, Elellanena gave birth to a daughter. This child, unlike others born into bondage on the estate, did not appear in the property ledger. Instead, her existence was recorded in Harrington's personal journal with unsettling pride. Providence has blessed the house with new life. Today I have named her Caroline after my mother. She has her eyes. In the months that followed, Elellanena and her infant daughter occupied the room near the kitchen that had been prepared so carefully. Inventory records listed items rarely, if ever, found in enslaved quarters. A rocking chair, a copper bathing tub, a small wooden cradle with proper linens on paper. It might have looked like comfort. In reality, it was a gilded confinement. Then came the first tragedy. In July 1838, when the heat pressed down on the coastal air like a hand, Caroline fell ill with fever. Dr. Thorne was summoned, but his treatments, tonics, poultices, and prayers did nothing. On July 23rd, at only 8 months old, Caroline died. No death certificate was filed. Enslaved children rarely warranted such official attention. But something highly unusual did happen. Caroline was not buried in the unmarked ground beyond the north field where others from the quarters were laid. Instead, Thomas Harrington ordered a small grave, dug beneath an oak tree at the eastern edge of the garden, on the side of the house reserved for displays of beauty, not suffering. The reaction of Elellanena herself was not captured in any formal document. Yet a letter written by a frequent visitor, Mary Stillwell, wife of a local merchant, preserved a rare glimpse. Writing to her sister in Charleston, she described coming upon the most disturbing scene at Foresight, a young enslaved woman kneeling at a fresh small grave in the garden, completely still. Making no sound, Harrington stood on the veranda, watching but did not interrupt. When she finally rose, Stillwell wrote, her face was entirely devoid of expression. I have never witnessed such contained grief, and it chilled me to my core. By the winter of 1838, before the ground had truly released the memory of Caroline's small grave, Elellanena was pregnant again. Life at Foresight Estate resumed its surface normality. Ledgers balanced, cotton harvested, guests entertained. But beneath that rigid routine, a pattern was forming, one that no one yet had the language to call a curse. As the second pregnancy progressed, estate records show further expenditures for the room near the kitchen. A larger bed, additional linens, and a lock installed on the door. In May 1839, she delivered a son. Harrington named him James after his own father. Household accounts from the time mentioned the boy's robust appetite and strong lungs. Small details recorded almost as if to convince themselves that this child would be different, that this life might be spared from whatever shadow had claimed the first. For nearly 10 months, his existence seemed to justify their hope.
But the darkness that had settled around Foresight Estate was not finished. In March 1840, James developed a respiratory illness that worsened with cruel speed. Despite repeated visits from Dr. Thorne, the child died on March 15th. Once again, Thomas Harrington ordered the body buried beneath the same oak tree, beside Caroline. No marker was placed this time, but the gardener's log noted one quiet act. Elellanena planted white roses at the site. In the official estate records, this period is summed up in a few dry notations: expenses, doctor's visits, references to melancholy, but later evidence suggests something inside that locked room had begun to fracture. Harrington left for Atlanta 3 days after the burial, and during his 2-week absence, the ledgers shift. Laundry counts rise sharply from Elellanenna's quarters. Kitchen logs show meals being sent up instead of collected by her hand. When Harrington returned, his journal contained a brief, uneasy entry: returned to find matters at home in disarray. Confined to her quarters. Mrs. Potter reports, extreme melancholy and refusal of food. Dr. Thorne consulted and has prescribed laudanum for nerves. Situation requires careful management. By the summer of 1840, outwardly at least, she appeared to have recovered enough to resume some duties in the house. But something had changed permanently, both in her and in Thomas Harrington. The children beneath the oak tree, Carolyn and James, were not just graves. They were secrets pressed into the soil, layers of guilt and grief that the house itself seemed to absorb. People continued to visit Foresight. Business was conducted, accounts were tallied, and from a distance the estate looked the same. Yet those who worked closest to the main house later spoke of a feeling in the air, especially near the eastern garden. Some said it was just the imagination of those who knew too much. Others were less sure. What can be said with certainty is that by the time the third pregnancy began, the story of Foresight Estate had crossed a threshold. The oak tree had become more than just a landmark in the garden. It was already, though no one would admit it, the heart of the haunting that would define everything that followed. The months following James's death passed with a strange and heavy quiet over Foresight Estate. Those who visited during that time often remarked that the place felt different, though they could never clearly say why. The gardens remained immaculate, the household duties continued with mechanical precision, and business affairs proceeded as Harrington required. Yet underneath that familiar rhythm, something invisible had shifted. Elellanena moved through the halls of the manor, with a silence so profound that it unsettled even those who had never dared to speak to her. Her grief had folded inward, calcified into a stillness that made people lower their voices in her presence. And as summer turned to autumn, that silence became the backdrop against which the next stage of tragedy began to unfold. By September of 1840. It became clear that Elellanena was once again with child. This time, the pregnancy seemed to provoke a more frantic reaction from Thomas Harrington than the previous two. Witnesses noted that he appeared distracted during meetings, agitated in conversations, and preoccupied with matters inside the house rather than the plantation that sustained his wealth. Frederick Montroe, a Savannah cotton broker, recorded in his commercial diary, "Harrington seems possessed by unusual agitation. Inquired about physicians in Charleston who might be more skilled than our local practitioners. For a man who had always taken pride in the estate's controlled order, his growing anxiety was as startling as it was telling. As Elellanena entered her third trimester, Harrington began arranging things that defied every norm of plantation life. He converted a small sitting room adjacent to his own bedroom into something that resembled a private birthing chamber. He brought in a midwife from Savannah, Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, who was instructed to live on the estate for the final month of the pregnancy. Her name appears in the estate payroll records, but she left no written account of what she witnessed. The only surviving mention comes from her daughter, who years later recalled her mother saying she had never seen a woman so silent in her suffering, nor a man so desperate in his hope. On April 10th, 1841, under the dim light of an oil lamp and the tense supervision of Thomas Harrington, Elellanena gave birth to her third child, a girl who would be named Elizabeth. The next morning, as though her existence were something he wanted sanctified immediately, Harrington summoned Reverend William Stokes from St. John's Episcopal Church to the estate to perform a private baptism. The church register, still preserved today, reflects this strange event. Only the father's name appears, Elizabeth Harrington, daughter of Thomas Harrington, baptized at Foresight Estate. April 11th, 1841. The absence of the mother's name, especially in such a context, is an omission that speaks louder than any written explanation ever could. For the first time, Harrington's journal filled with daily entries describing one of the children. He noted Elizabeth's changing eye color from the faint blue of early infancy to the rich brown that mirrored Elellanena. He described her first smile, her reactions to his voice, and the way she clutched his thumb with surprising strength. In an act of quiet obsession, he commissioned a portrait of the infant from a Savannah artist. That painting, damaged by moisture, would be discovered a century later in the estate's attic. At the time, however, it symbolized something that no one around him dared to articulate: the master's desperation to hold on to something innocent in a world built on cruelty. But innocence does not survive long in a place like Foresight Estate. In August of 1841, when the heat again settled over Savannah, like a suffocating blanket. Elizabeth began showing signs of illness. Dr. Thorne was summoned immediately. This time, however, Harrington's panic was so intense that he sent a rider to Charleston to fetch a second physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, known for his expertise in childhood diseases. For 2 days, the doctors worked together, their efforts recorded only in fragments in their logs. But no combination of remedies, tonics, or prayers could halt the progression of whatever illness had taken hold of the child. On August 17th, just 4 months old, Elizabeth died. This death affected Harrington in ways the previous two had not. Or perhaps it only amplified wounds he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Estate records reveal that he purchased a marble headstone for Elizabeth's grave, the first formal marker he had ever commissioned for a child buried under the oak tree. It was found decades later during an archaeological survey, broken, eroded, and nearly unreadable, but unmistakably real in the days following Elizabeth's burial. Foresight Estate entered a period of frantic disarray. On August 20th, Harrington left for Savannah on business, but for reasons unknown, he returned that same evening. Something had occurred in his absence, something that became the turning point of the entire Foresight story. The next morning, on August 21st, Elellanena Bowmont was gone. She had simply vanished. The room near the kitchen was empty. No one had seen her leave. No one knew where she had gone. Harrington did not alert authorities, an omission that historians still regard as deeply suspicious. Instead, he privately ordered his overseer to find her and return her quietly, offering a substantial reward. For 3 days, an unrecorded search took place through the woods, the outer fields, and the abandoned structures at the edge of the estate. Finally, she was located, not dead, not injured, not escaped, but sitting alone in the abandoned hunting cabin 4 miles from the main house. Described in the overseer's terse report as unharmed but unwell in mind. She was taken back to the house under watch, and what followed next marked the beginning of the estate's darkest chapter. Elellanena was moved to a 3rd-floor room, far from the kitchen, far from the garden, far from any place where she had ever found even the smallest sliver of peace. Household accounts record the installation of a special lock on the door and the boarding up of the windows from the outside. Dr. Thorne visited her twice a week, noting in his medical log, "Patient continues under sedation. Refuses food when lucid. Speaks of children calling to her from beneath the oak." Within those walls, surrounded by silence and sedation, something was breaking beyond repair. And as the autumn of 1841 approached, everyone at Foresight, whether they admitted it or not, already sensed that the estate was operating on borrowed time. Something was unraveling. Something was preparing to end. The oak tree no longer simply shaded the graves of 3 children. It had become the quiet center of a truth no one yet dared to speak. The final months of 1841 brought with them an atmosphere at Foresight, a state that even the most hardened overseers would later describe as unnatural. The house seemed to hold its breath. Servants moved quietly, as though sound itself might provoke something lurking at the edges of grief and madness. Elellanena remained confined in the locked 3rd-floor room, sedated, watched, and spoken about only in hushed tones. Her disappearance and recovery had shaken the household in ways people were afraid to express openly. And though Thomas Harrington tried to resume his routines, he walked through his own home like a man shadowed by something only he could see. Then, in early October, everything reached its breaking point. Dr. Thorne's medical log from this period is sparse, deliberately vague. But one entry written with an unsteady hand would later become one of the central fragments in reconstructing the truth. Patient delivered of stillborn male child during night. No midwife present. Infant already wrapped and prepared for burial upon my arrival. Severe blood loss. Unfit for transport. The entry is dated October 11th, 1841. The implications were chilling. Elellanena had gone into labor alone, locked in a room, drugged, isolated, and still recovering from her 3rd child's death only weeks earlier. There was no midwife, no attendants, No comfort. When Dr. Thorne arrived, the infant was already dead, already wrapped, already set aside, as though the event had been anticipated rather than feared. What happened in that room before the doctor arrived has never been fully understood. Some historians believe the stillbirth was natural. Others suggest something far more deliberate. But what is universally agreed upon is that this event shattered what remained of Elellanen's fragile stability. Harrington's journal offers a single, ominous line the next day. It is finished. May God have mercy on us all. The morning after the stillbirth, house records show that the third-floor room was emptied and cleaned. The boards on the window remained in place. Then, without fanfare, without witness, and without record, Elellanena Bowmont vanished from the estate's documentation entirely. But this disappearance was not peaceful. Nor was it simple. For decades, no one knew what had truly happened to her. Plantation rumors circulated that she had died from blood loss, that she had taken her own life, that Harrington had ordered her buried secretly to avoid scandal. But none of these stories accounted for what would emerge more than a century later. For now, all that is known from the 1841 record is that Elellanena left the estate in the dead of night, under circumstances carefully orchestrated by Harrington and Dr. Thorne. She was removed from her locked room. She was not taken to a hospital, despite Dr. Thorne's explicit recommendation. Instead, she was led or carried out the back corridor of the house, placed in a carriage, and transported under the cloak of darkness to St. John's Episcopal Church in Savannah. What happened inside those church walls would remain hidden for 162 years back at the estate. Harrington withdrew into a state that business associates later described as gray, detached, unnerved. He spent days at a time sitting on the veranda facing the garden, staring at the oak tree under which his children lay buried Carolyn. James, Elizabeth, and now a fourth infant whose grave was never officially marked. The overseer ran operations with minimal supervision. House staff exchanged fearful glances, but dared not speak openly. Visitors to the estate reported a strange heaviness, as though the air itself was saturated with unspoken grief. Meanwhile, the story of Elellanenna's final hours unknown to everyone but Harrington, Dr. Thorne, and the clergy was being quietly sealed away. The fourth child, a stillborn son, was buried beneath the oak tree alongside his siblings. But there was something different about this burial. The gardener's log for that week lists a line that scholars still debate today: disturbance in earth beneath oak. Fourth place deeper than rest. Why deeper? Why disturbed? Why no marker? No one has ever answered. What is clear is that the oak tree, which had once shaded peaceful garden paths, had become a place of secrets, sorrow, and something darker than either. The ground beneath it held more than bodies. It held the truth of what happened to those 4 children and the woman who bore them. And though the estate would physically decay over time, this single tree would continue to anchor the darkest chapter in its history. After the stillbirth, Harrington isolated himself from the estate entirely. He made arrangements for extended stays in Savannah and Charleston, leaving his cousin Walter in charge. But even as the years passed, he remained haunted by what had transpired at Foresight. In later confessions shared only in drunken moments with Walter, he hinted that the deaths of the children, those tiny lives that appeared and vanished so quickly, were not accidents, were not illnesses, were not acts of God. They were something else entirely. Something he feared acknowledging even to himself. And so Elellanena Bowmont slipped from the plantation, not into freedom, not into safety, but into the murky void of unrecorded history for nearly 2 centuries. No one knew whether she had died that October night, been buried secretly on the estate, or vanished into some private hell from which no trace remained. It would take a discovery in a church well over 160 years later to finally expose what had truly happened to her. But that revelation belonged to a future chapter. For now, in the autumn of 1841, the only certainty was this: 4 children slept beneath the oak. Their mother was gone. And Foresight Estate had begun its slow descent into ruin haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of what no one dared to speak. For months after Elellena's disappearance, Foresight Estate moved like a wounded creature alive, functioning, but unmistakably altered. What had once been a home obsessed with order now felt suspended in a kind of moral fog. The locked third-floor room had been emptied. The windows remained boarded from the outside. The housekeepers refused to enter after nightfall. Even the overseer, a man not known for sentiment, avoided the eastern garden where the oak tree stood, its roots spreading quietly over 4 unmarked graves. The truth of what happened in those last weeks of 1841 had been deliberately wrapped in silence, buried under carefully chosen omissions, and sealed away by the man who needed that silence the most, Thomas Harrington. Yet the past has a way of refusing to stay buried in the years following Elellena's disappearance. Harrington's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He traveled often, spending long stretches in Savannah and Charleston, leaving the estate under the management of his cousin Walter Harrington. Letters exchanged between business partners suggest that Thomas was haunted not only by grief, but by fear of rumors, fear of scandal, fear of a truth he believed God himself might punish him for. One business associate described him as a man forever listening for footsteps. Those words, written casually in a letter not meant for future eyes, capture the unraveling better than any official document. Meanwhile, life at Foresight did not fully resume its former rhythm. Workers whispered among themselves. Strange noises were reported, the sound of soft singing near the garden, footsteps on the veranda long after the house had gone still, and the unsettling sense that someone was walking the halls at night. The overseer dismissed these accounts as foolishness, claiming they were born from fear rather than fact. Yet the stories persisted, and in time became woven into the very identity of the estate. But the true revelations came not from rumors, but from documents fragmented, scattered, and discovered over decades. In 1858, when Thomas Harrington died at the age of 69, his will was found to contain a single unusual stipulation. The oak tree in the eastern garden was never to be removed, and the ground around it was never to be disturbed. No explanation was given, no justification recorded. It was simply written as law, etched in the final document of a man who had tried to erase so much. After the Civil War, the plantation fell into disrepair. The land changed hands, debts accumulated, and by 1872, the estate had become nearly unrecognizable. That same year, the lumber company that purchased the land finally violated the will's stipulation. The oak tree, old, enormous, and inconvenient for development, was cut down. When its roots were lifted, the workers discovered 4 small sets of remains. 3 were expected. 1 was not. The 4th set belonged to an infant barely large enough to fill the palm of a hand. There was no coffin, no wrapping, no marker, nothing to who had placed the child there or why. The discovery rattled the workers, baffled the newspaper reporters who covered it, and reignited old whispers among Savannah residents about what had happened at Foresight Estate in the early 1840s, but without records, and without the voices of those who lived it. The truth remained buried in speculation, and it might have stayed that way had it not been for a sealed envelope hidden among the belongings of Dr. Samuel Thorne, the plantation physician, who had attended all 4 births. When Dr. Thorne died in 1872, a nephew, sorting through personal papers, found an envelope marked Foresight Estate, confidential. He handed it over to local authorities who, uncertain what to do with it, filed it among county archives where it sat unnoticed for decades. Inside was a single sheet of paper dated October 11th, 1841, written the morning after the stillbirth. I fear the outcome is predetermined. I record this to clear my conscience. This note, written by a man who rarely questioned plantation practices, suggested that what happened afterward was not a natural death, not an accident, but the result of choices made deliberately. perhaps by more than one person, but the most explosive discovery came far later. In 1969, more than a century after, Elellanena had vanished during renovations at St. John's Episcopal Church, the same church where Elizabeth had been baptized workers. Discovered a hidden compartment behind a vestry wall. Inside were 3 items: a cloth pouch containing dried herbs, a wooden carving of a woman holding 4 indistinct bundles, and a folded, yellowed letter addressed to Father William. What emerged from this letter became known as the Sullivan Confession, written by Reverend James Sullivan, an assistant priest. It described Elellanena being brought to the church on the night of October 13th, barely alive, sedated, and accompanied by Harrington and Dr. Thorne. Sullivan confessed to arranging passage for her on a ship bound for New Orleans under the pretense of sanctuary. What he did not expect was that, before sedation took her, she spoke to him with haunting clarity. All 4 sleep beneath the oak. I sang to them as they passed. It was the only kindness I could offer. He believed she might be admitting to ending their lives. But then she added, the sin was not mine. The sin was bringing them into this world, knowing what awaited them. Sullivan wrote that he was unsure whether he had participated in concealing a crime or aiding a woman destroyed by grief. He ended with, may God have mercy on us all for what is done in the name of prosperity and order. This confession remained hidden for decades, deemed too disturbing, too uncertain, too damaging to local history, but once uncovered, it changed everything. It reframed Elellanena not as a silent victim swallowed by the system, but potentially as a woman pushed so far into the margins of humanity that her final choices, whatever they truly were, could only be understood through the unbearable calculus of survival under slavery. As historians later noted, the truth lies somewhere in the space between mercy and despair. And as the nation moved into the late 20th century, another discovery waited. Buried deep beneath the ground where the oak tree once stood, a discovery that would finally bring Elellenena's voice back from the dead. But that belonged to the next chapter. By the time the 20th century arrived, most of Foresight Estate existed only in fragments, scattered records, fading memories, and a handful of artifacts that hinted at the truth without fully revealing it. The land had been transformed repeatedly, from plantation to lumber yard, from industrial site to shopping center. Brick by brick, the past had been buried beneath concrete, asphalt, and commerce. But history has a peculiar way of resurfacing when it refuses to be forgotten. And in 2012, nearly 177 years after Elellanena first arrived at Foresight Estate, the earth yielded its most intimate secret that year. A team of archaeologists from the University of Georgia was granted permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of the former Foresight property, now a parking lot bordered by stores and fast food restaurants. Most expected to find nothing more than soil disturbances from past construction. But in the far eastern corner, at the exact place where the oak tree once stood, the radar revealed a rectangular void approximately 15 feet. Underground, an anomaly too structured to be natural. Curiosity turned to urgency. Within weeks, an excavation was approved. The chamber uncovered was an old root cellar, its wooden frame partially collapsed, its contents preserved only by chance. Inside lay a small chest, the wood soft and crumbling from age, but miraculously intact. When it was lifted into the light and carefully opened, the archaeologists found objects that silenced the entire team. Inside were 4 cloth dolls of descending size, arranged in a row, primitive, worn, and heartbreakingly symbolic. A child's knitted cap lay folded beside them, its size small enough to fit in the palm of the hand. Beneath these items lay a hand-copied page from a prayer book, its ink blurred but legible enough to reveal verses about release from earthly suffering. And at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in decayed fabric, was a journal. The cloth binding was discolored, The pages warped from moisture, but several entries were still readable. The handwriting matched that found on the back of the tiny ivory portrait inside the silver locket, discovered decades earlier. The portrait believed to have been of Elellanena herself, for the first time in nearly 2 centuries. Elellanena Bowmont spoke in her own words. The first legible entry was dated July 25th, 1838, 2 days after the death of her first child. Carolyn. They have put Carolyn beneath the oak tree. Master T calls it a favor. He does not understand that the ground consumes us all the same. I sit by her small mound when duties allow. I have begun to hate the oak, for the weight it will place upon her small body as its roots grow. Yet, I also find myself touching its bark, for it still lives while she does not. Is this what mothers become here? Women who speak to trees because their children lie beneath them? The words were not merely grief, they were revelation. They exposed a level of emotional articulation that plantation owners deliberately erased from enslaved people's lives. She mourned with clarity, insight, and a haunting awareness of her own erasure. Another entry, dated March 18th, 1840, written after the death of her son James, deepened the tragedy. James has joined his sister. The doctor says his lungs were weak. What he does not say is why. The dampness of our room, the work I did with him tied to my back until my 7th month, the poor milk my tired body made. These are the true causes, though they will never be written in the ledgers. Master T weeps and calls it God's will. I have stopped weeping. Tears are a luxury for those who expect fairness. I no longer expect it. It was a devastating, precise indictment of the system that shaped her life. Through these passages, historians glimpsed not only a mother's grief, but an enslaved woman's intellectual clarity, a mind documenting the reality that official records refused to acknowledge. But the most chilling entry, one that redefined the entire history of Foresight Estate, was dated August 19th, 1841, 2 days after the death of her 3rd child, Elizabeth. The 3rd has returned to the stars. Master T rages. He spoke of taking her to Savannah where lighter skin raises fewer questions. But she has escaped such a life. I look at the one inside me now, my 4th and final burden, and I know what I must do. There are kinder doorways to the next world than the ones this place offers. My grandmother taught me how to find them. May she forgive me? May they all forgive me? This entry ignited fierce debate. Was Elellanena confessing intent? Was she speaking metaphorically, spiritually, despairingly like a mother whose grief had overtaken reason? Or was she describing the knowledge of harmful remedies passed down through generations of women who had survived slavery long enough to understand that mercy sometimes wore terrifying forms? The herb pouch found in the church wall in 1969 containing dried foxglove, Jimson weed, and yew berries suggested possibilities that no historian wished to fully confirm. Even more mysterious was how Elellena's journal ended up buried beneath the oak tree. Did she hide it herself? Did another enslaved person, fearing what Harrington might do with it, conceal it after her disappearance? Or did someone try to preserve her voice when the world sought to erase it? No answer has ever been found. The root cellar, once used for storing food, had become a secret tomb of memory place, where someone intentionally safeguarded the fragments of a life that official narratives would never record. And when that chamber was sealed again by soil and time, it became a place of waiting, holding her words until the world was finally willing to listen. The discovery of the journal shattered the sanitized version of Foresight Estate's history. It forced historians to confront a truth far more painful than any ghost story, the story of a woman who had been stripped of agency in life but managed, through fragments preserved against all odds, to speak across nearly 2 centuries. The land where the oak tree once stood had become a parking lot, but beneath that asphalt, buried in silence, her story had waited, undisturbed, until the earth itself surrendered it, and the next revelations found not in soil, But in archives would ignite the research that finally restored Elellanena Bowmont's name to history by the mid-20th century. Elellanena Bowmont had become exactly what the plantation system intended her to be, a footnote, a whisper, a name buried beneath layers of silence, shame, and deliberate erasure. The few records that mentioned her reduced her entire existence to transactions, domestic duties, and the births and deaths of children treated as incidents rather than lives. Foresight Estate itself had dissolved into decay. The oak tree was gone. The manor was gone. Even the land had changed so completely that people shopping for groceries or parking, their cars had no idea what they were stepping on. But in 1963, more than 120 years after Elellanena vanished from the third-floor room, a graduate student opened. A door that history had tried very hard to close. Forever. Her name was Margaret Wilson, a young researcher from the University of Georgia. She arrived in Savannah to study the disappearances of enslaved women in the antebellum South, a topic that most scholars avoided because the records were fragmented, unsettling, and often aggressively suppressed. But what others avoided, Wilson gravitated toward. She was fascinated by the gaps, the silences that suggested something terrible had happened, but had never been allowed to surface in the archives of the Savannah Historical Society. She found fragments, a payroll ledger from Foresight Estate, a church record with a baptism, but no mother listed a torn page from Dr. Thorne's medical journal, a receipt for a silver locket, and a newspaper clipping about the 1872 discovery of 4 infant remains each. Piece was insignificant on its own. Together, they formed the outline of something monstrous. Wilson's curiosity sharpened into obsession. She traveled to Charleston, to Louisiana, to tiny county courthouses, to private collections guarded by families whose wealth had once depended on slavery. Piece by piece, she resurrected a story that had been intentionally scattered. She discovered the 1841 bill of sale transferring an unnamed domestic servant. Aged 28, in delicate health, from Thomas Harrington to a plantation owner in St. Francisville. Louisiana, document dated October 13th, 1841. The day after Elellena's stillbirth, this was the first clue that Elellanena had survived the ordeal at Foresight Estate only to be sold again in secret. Wilson tried to trace her life beyond that date. But Louisiana's courthouse fires during the Civil War had obliterated most records. The trail ended abruptly, leaving Wilson with only implications and shadows. Still, she pressed on, her dissertation completed in 1967, but never published, boldly argued that Elellanena Bowmont was not dead on October 12th, as some had believed, but was instead sold in secrecy, possibly because she knew too much about the children's deaths, and possibly because Thomas Harrington feared what she might reveal. Wilson's work should have made her career. Instead, it nearly ended it, and she sought access to certain archives connected to the Harrington family. She found doors closed without explanation. Collections that had once been available were suddenly under reorganization. Families who had initially agreed to interviews abruptly rescinded permission. And then came the letters, anonymous, unsettling, urging her to focus on a different topic, warning that local families do not appreciate inquiries into ancient matters. And finally, more bluntly, that not all histories wish to be disturbed. Wilson wrote to her academic advisor in frustration. I feel resistance at every turn. It is as though the deeper I dig, the more someone wants this story to stay buried. Within a year, she abandoned the project entirely. She accepted a teaching position at a small New England college. She never returned to the research. Her dissertation sat untouched in university archives for decades, its pages quietly collecting dust while the world moved on. But the story would not stay buried. In 2003-40. Years after Wilson first opened, the file historian Eliza Montgomery discovered the hidden Sullivan confession behind the church wall. The letter's details matched Margaret Wilson's hypotheses almost perfectly, validating work that had once been dismissed as excessively imaginative. Montgomery's subsequent paper, Complicity and Conscience. The Church and Foresight Estate reopened academic interest in the case. It also led to the examination of maritime records from October 1841. Records that confirmed that a woman listed only as female Negro, infirm, died aboard the merchant ship Carolina Star on October 17th. 2 days into its journey to New Orleans, she was buried at sea. Scholars now widely accept this passenger as Elellanena Bowmont. The mystery of her final destination was resolved, not with a marked grave, not with a recorded death certificate, but with a line in a ship's log describing a burial in the Atlantic Ocean, a burial without ceremony, without name, without witnesses, without dignity. It was the final erasure in a life full of erasures. Yet it was precisely this ending anonymous, silent, devastating, that sparked a movement among historians, educators, and descendants seeking to restore Elellanenna's identity. Wilson's Lost Research, Montgomery's publication, and the discoveries of the herb pouch, the carving, and the journal collectively transformed Elellanena from a vanished figure into a symbol of the hidden histories of enslaved women. For decades, people had walked past the place where Foresight Estate once stood without knowing the tragedies layered beneath their feet. Now, because of the work of women like Wilson and Montgomery, the name Elellanena Bowmont was finally spoken aloud in academic conferences, museum exhibits, and public discussions. History had tried to silence her. The land had tried to bury her. The ocean had tried to swallow her. But through the persistence of those who refused to forget, her story began to rise piece by piece out of the darkness. In the next chapter, the Harrington family themselves would finally confront the past they had spent generations avoiding. By the early 21st century, most people believed the story of Foresight Estate was finished. The house was long gone, the land repurposed, the oak tree reduced to scattered roots beneath asphalt. For decades, the Harrington family, once among Savannah's wealthiest, had distanced themselves from the plantation era entirely. Their descendants became merchants, lawyers, politicians, and philanthropists. They funded charities, sat on museum boards, and lived in neighborhoods far removed from the past that had built their ancestors' fortunes. But history has a way of looping back, forcing those who inherit silence to face the truth buried beneath it. In 2008, Catherine Harrington Wells, a distant descendant of Thomas Harrington, made a surprising and unprecedented decision. She donated a large collection of family papers to the Savannah Historical Society journals, letters, receipts, and estate documents that had been preserved in attics, trunks, and private boxes for more than 150 years. The Harrington name no longer carried the weight it once had, but among Savannah's oldest families, such collections were often still guarded like relics. In the midst of these papers, archivists found a water-damaged leather journal belonging to Walter Harrington, Thomas's cousin and the man who took over management of Foresight in the 1840s. Most of the entries were mundane notes about cotton yields, debts owed, and the usual anxieties of plantation economics. But one passage, dated April 1842, stood out like a blade glinting in the dark. Thomas confided in me today after several brandies. I wish he had not. Some knowledge cannot be unknown once spoken. He believes the children were taken by divine retribution for his sins. That is easier for him than the alternative the doctor suggested, that they might have been helped to their ends. When I asked by whom, he looked at me with such hollow sorrow and said, "By the one who loved them too much to let them live as she had to live. I will not write the rest." This line exploded through the academic world. Here, finally, was a contemporary acknowledgement, not rumor, not speculation of the possibility that Elellanena herself had acted. Whether out of despair, spiritual belief, resistance, or mercy, the question lingered like an open wound. But the journal did more than reopen old debates. It forced the Harrington family to reassess their own identity. Catherine Harrington. Wells later explained that she had grown tired of the sanitized family stories, the ones that painted Foresight Estate as a relic of Southern heritage, rather than a site of profound suffering and mystery. In interviews, she admitted that the family had long whispered about a tragedy, but refused to name it. Older relatives discouraged questions. Portraits of Thomas Harrington were kept in storage, not displayed. And when she finally requested access to family archives, she found entire boxes marked simply restricted, many sealed since the 19th century. Catherine described the moment she read Walter's 1842 journal entry as a blow to the soul. It shattered the illusions she had been raised with. The Harrington family, like so many plantation dynasties, had built its reputation on carefully curated narratives of benevolence, civility, and order. But beneath that facade lay a legacy of cruelty, exploitation, secrecy, and something darker than even she had imagined. Determined to confront the truth rather than hide from it, she founded the Harrington Wells Memorial Foundation. Its purpose was radical for its lineage, to acknowledge the lives of all enslaved people at Foresight Estate, to support research on enslaved women's histories to preserve Elellanena Bowmont's memory, and to create educational programs focusing on resistance, agency, and the silenced histories of the antebellum South for the first time in nearly 2 centuries. Harrington publicly acknowledged the tragedies tied to their ancestors. The foundation funded archaeological surveys, historical research, and the installation of a new, expansive historical marker at the former estate site. Unlike the earlier marker, which blandly noted Harrington family plantation, the new one listed Elellanena Bowmont's name, the 4 children, and the years of their births and deaths. It addressed the deaths directly. It acknowledged the possibility that Elellanena acted from a place of unbearable suffering, and it named the system slavery that created the conditions for these tragedies. It was a small act in the shadow of great injustice. But it mattered. In 2015, the foundation commissioned the creation of a memorial garden at the exact location of the oak tree. 4 small stone markers represented Carolyn, James, Elizabeth, and the unnamed stillborn son. At the center stood a bronze sculpture, a woman with her face tilted upward, arms slightly raised, not begging, not surrendering, but releasing something unseen into the air. The artist, Amara Johnson, described it as a tribute not only to Elellanina's suffering, but to her final act of agency. Whatever its true nature may have been, she was denied freedom in life. This sculpture shows her claiming it in memory. Local residents began leaving white roses at the base of the statue, just as Elellanena had once planted them over James's grave. No one ever admitted to placing them. Sometimes they appeared at dawn, sometimes late at night. And every year, on the week of August 17th, the anniversary of Elizabeth's death, multiple visitors reported seeing the same apparition, a woman in outdated dress walking slowly through the garden. She stops at each of the 4 stones. She bends her head as if listening, and then she vanishes. Skeptics call it a myth. Local historians call it collective memory. Residents simply say, she's checking on them. The Harrington family's reckoning did not end with a memorial. It extended into classrooms, museums, academic discourse, and personal identity. Descendants now grapple with the weight of inheritance, not just wealth or land, but responsibility. Responsibility to acknowledge. Responsibility to repair. Responsibility to remember. Catherine Wells once said in a dedication speech, "We cannot undo what was done here, but we can refuse to look away. We can refuse to let silence be inherited alongside blood." For the first time since the 1840s, the legacy of Foresight Estate was no longer defined by the man who owned it. It belonged to the woman it tried to erase. By the time the memorial garden was completed in 2015, nearly everything that had once been Foresight Estate had vanished from the physical world. The manor was gone. The fields were gone. The enslaved quarters were gone. Even the soil itself had been shifted, layered, paved over. Only the faintest traces of the oak tree's roots remained beneath. A parking lot that bore no visible sign of the lives buried there, and yet, despite every attempt across 2 centuries to silence or forget her, Elellanena Bowmont's story refused to die in many ways. It grew stronger. Researchers, students, archivists, and ordinary visitors found themselves drawn into her history, not because of the supernatural whispers that clung to the land, but because her humanity, once stripped away, was finally being restored piece by piece. That restoration did not come from plantation ledgers or official records, which had always reduced enslaved people to property and labor. Instead, it emerged from the fragments saved in secret letters hidden behind church walls, journals buried underground, artifacts tucked into attics, whispered oral histories passed down by families who had seen more than they could safely say. These fragments scattered across states and generations formed a tapestry more powerful than any single document could have been, and at the heart of that tapestry was one undeniable truth. What the system tried hardest to erase was the one thing that survived: her voice. Through her journal entries, Elellanena made herself known. She described not only her grief, but her clarity, her bitterness, her love, and the crushing reality of being forced to bear children whose futures she already knew would be filled with suffering. Her words gave shape to the emotional world that plantation records refused to acknowledge. The carved wooden figure of a woman holding 4 indistinct bundles revealed the endurance of her cultural memory. It hinted at West African artistic traditions kept alive despite efforts to destroy them. It made visible the spiritual lens through which she viewed life and death. The herb pouch, once dismissed as superstition, later revealed knowledge of medicinal and toxic plants that enslaved women used for healing, for self-protection, and in desperate times for mercy. Whether Elellanena used such knowledge deliberately remains a subject of debate, but the possibility alone reshaped how scholars interpreted her story. And the Sullivan, confession written by a man tormented by the role he played, provided a rare acknowledgement from within the white clergy of Savannah, admitting that the church had not only witnessed suffering but participated in its concealment. These pieces did not create a flawless portrait. Too much was lost. Too much was never recorded. Too much was destroyed. But they created enough for historians to understand the scale of what happened. Enough for descendants to challenge inherited myths. Enough for communities to honor the woman at the center of the tragedy in the memorial garden. Where the oak tree once stood, the 4 small stone markers created a circle of quiet reflection. The bronze sculpture of the woman, her arms lifted slightly. Her face turned upward stood not as a mourning figure, but as one releasing something into the sky. Truth, perhaps. Or memory. Or burden. Or all 3. Visitors described feeling a heaviness there, not of fear, but of awareness. The land carried a resonance, an ache, like the echo of a cry long finished, yet still vibrating in the air. People left offerings, white roses, children's toys, folded prayers, slips of paper bearing the names of their own ancestors. Some came seeking history. Some came seeking forgiveness. Some came simply because they felt they should. And every year, around mid-August, reports continued to surface of a woman in outdated clothing. Walking through the garden at 3 a.m., she always stopped at each of the 4 markers. She always faced the eastern corner where the oak once stood. And she always vanished before anyone could approach. Scientists dismissed these accounts. Local residents accepted them. Historians remained silent, but for many, the apparition was not a haunting , it was a remembering , because, in the end, the story of Elellanena Bowmont was not a ghost story, not truly. It was the story of a woman forced into silence who was finally heard. It was the story of a mother whose children were denied life, yet whose love survived centuries. It was the story of a system designed to erase people so completely that even their grief was considered property , and yet, despite all of this, she endured, not in body, not in grave, but In memory, her final journal passage, one of the few that survived intact, now appears on a metal plaque at the entrance to the garden. Historians still debate whether she truly wrote it or whether it represents a collective voice attributed to her over generations. But its truth transcends authorship. They say we have no souls to save, yet they fear our spirits after death. They say we are not fully human, yet they tremble when our humanity shows itself. Remember this: what they took from us in life, we reclaim in memory. Whether those words belong to Elellanena alone or to thousands of women like her, they stand as the final testament of Foresight Estate, a place where suffering tried to hide, a place where silence tried to win, a place where one woman, meant to vanish, instead became unforgettable. Elellanena Bowmont has no grave, no marker bearing her name, no recorded burial. But she has something far more enduring. She has memory. She has voice. She has presence. And presence, once awakened, is a force that cannot be enslaved. Her story still echoes for those willing to listen. And it will continue to echo long after the land itself forgets the shape of the house that once stood there.